the English kings they didn't drop the use of the title of king, I guess, kings of France. So for centuries after 1453, when referring to themselves, they would often refer themselves as the King of England, Ireland, and France. So in spite of the defeat, they maintain this ideological claim to the king, I guess, to the Kingdom of France. And we see this.
We said that the English were driven out of France. How were they able to be to infiltrate so well? Was it the longbow? Was that gave them the edge? Because they had a smaller population, you said.
Yeah, the longbow certainly was, again, questions of some bad battles by the French, misorganization, the use of the longbow, which was in many ways much more effective than, than the. And you have, in a sense, you have this period, this continuing warfare where you also have, I have to look, at certain points, diseases, the Black Plague spread in, so you have a situation where much of what this region of northern France was actually quite depopulated by warfare, by, epidemics, and unlike later national wars, again, it's very much as these, from the European side, it was very often the nobility, it wasn't necessarily the peasantry being recruited to go out and fight, whereas at least from the British side, from what I've read, the longbow was much more, perhaps more egalitarian. So in a sense, to create a full suit of armor in medieval times was horribly expensive.
Oh, yeah, you needed like 150 acres to be a knight.
Exactly so.
Support yourself.
Whereas the longbow, it required a lot of time and training. So to be able to use it effectively, you need to spend a lot of time to do it. But it's cheap in a sense to have. So you needed a lot of people to train them. But in terms of cost, it was a lot more, in a sense, cheaper to equip, let's say, a group of soldiers with a longbow than a group of knights, with the armor. So.
I have one more quick question. You mentioned earlier the Scandinavian influence.
Yes.
I didn't really catch what is that exactly.
Oh, so the Scandinavian, so you have a period, so roughly the end of the first millennium, so 700s, 800s, 900s. You have, for reasons, again, maybe it was problems, environmental problems, maybe questions of food. You have, in a sense, the stereotypical, the Vikings, so then that are leaving Scandinavia and setting sail basically to attack and pillage much of Southern Europe. And very often they would settle in, in various regions of, Europe. So you have, for example, in England, if you look, for example, usually the towns or cities that end with B, so BY, usually these are, sort of Scandinavian origin. So, and same thing, you have, some colonies that are set up, also in Ireland, I believe Scotland as well, France, some in Italy, some, in the Mediterranean. So you have so the Scandinavians using their, setting sail and attacking, in a sense, attacking monasteries, attacking various ports along the coast. So what you have, is in, I believe it was the year 900 and some, but it basically roughly in the beginning of the 10th century, the monarch of what we would not consider France simply said, tell you what, we'll give you this chunk of land, you set up yourself up as nobles, and fight off any of your kin that sails back down. So, and hence the word Normandy, Normand means Northman, Norseman. So, and the men from the north. So you have sort of the Scandinavian, speaking sort of a Germanic language, establishing themselves in this region. But for the most part, they didn't necessarily bring wives with them. So you have, very often, the men establishing themselves as the dukes and the earls and etc. But they then marry into the local royal lines, and eventually their children will speak will speak the language, the local language. So they are then assimilated into, into the local language. So speaking this variation of, Latin that's becoming Old French, so what we then refer to, as Norman French. So by the time, between this period, roughly the 900s, where they settled, they established themselves, they became sort of, the nobility of Norman region of France, to 1066, they were already speaking, they had abandoned their language of origin, but they were now speaking a variation of French with certain subtle differences because of, in the sense of, I guess, their region of origin. And I'll give you an example. So, for example, my own ancestry coming from, I guess, from this region, there are, if I look at the word Bouchard, there are two options as to what the name may mean. One is there's a French word boucharder. It's like using with a small hammer and kind of hitting, I guess, at something, so perhaps related. The other variation would be it's derived from the word bouchard, which would mean a fortified place. So again, which would make sense. So in a sense, because we have this very long ties, I guess, to the Norse, in the sense of Germanics, so maybe some of the names would have been kind of names somebody from, so I guess, coming from a fortified place or establishing themselves. So there are some perhaps traces that are left of, I guess, these Normans, I guess the Norsemen, the Northmen coming and establishing themselves in northern France. But again, so they're just kind of little, maybe almost like little snippets here and there. But for the most part, their role was in assimilating themselves to France, but also playing this role in establishing this new royal line, I guess, in England. And again, we have, so for the most part, I guess it was, and the Viking attacks were quite common across, I guess, across Europe. So the solution here, again, was simply to let them settle, and then so they can fight off their own kin, I guess, more effectively. So it was kind of a nice, an easy compromise from the point, and so they figured it was easier letting go of some territory in exchange for, I guess, for getting to, I guess, being protected. Back to the Reformation. So this is, you have good old Martin Luther, a German, I guess we can retroactively say a German-speaking monk, who starts the whole thing by nailing a set of 92 theses to basically to the door of a church in, I guess, in Germany. Originally written in Latin, this was translated into German and eventually into French, English, and a whole other series of languages. And using the power of the printing press, it spread across, in a sense, spread across Europe. And does anybody know what was, I guess, Martin Luther's big beef? What was the thing that, in a sense, that spurred him to, in a sense, to write these theses?
Just a guess, but speaking, being able to like preach or write the Bible in vernacular?
But even before then, the big thing is, has anybody here heard of indulgences? So the big thing that really motivated, in a sense, Martin Luther was, at that point, was the Catholic Church's sale of indulgences. And the sale of indulgence was pay money, get something you love out of purgatory. So it's in a sense, it was a way, in a sense, that especially at that point, the Catholic Church was using to raise money. So that, along with, I guess, a whole other series, of practices. But it is, in a sense, it was this sale of indulgences in Germany that eventually, in a sense, that pushed Martin Luther to, I guess, to write these 92 theses. And eventually, this would lead to the Reformation, where a lot of the practices and, in a sense, the ways of, in a sense, the ways of believing, the ways of practicing one's faith, was to be, in a sense, completely changed and overhauled as part of this, I guess, the spread of the Reformation.